Right.
All right. So, pretty much, one of the huge things that we've talked about through the first 15 episodes or so now of conflicts of interest has been Julian Assange's trial and, how that's been going. We're on week 4 now, and that looks like it will be the last week of witness testimony. And so there's a lot of, kind of important stuff that's happened this week. And we also want to take some time to talk about this story that Matt Blumenthal wrote up, but this larger UC Global scandal where it's very clear the rights of Julian Assange have been thoroughly violated by the CIA, using this cutout UC Global to spy on his privileged conversations with his like defense attorneys and lawyers, and potentially even plot the poisoning and killing of Julian Assange. So, Will, maybe we should just start with some updates on the trial. Any big takeaways from what's happened in the past week?
Yeah, I guess real quick, just because like we are now approaching the end of like the actual testimony in his hearings, like maybe we can just like kind of swing back a little bit and recap what's been said before we get to this week. So just they have covered quite a bit of ground over the last couple weeks. They've talked about the fact that Assange published classified material in his role as a journalist, and that this was done in the public interest, not as some kind of like cyber criminal hacker or something. They've talked about how the charges against him are politically motivated, how the U.S. is sort of like has an axe to grind. They've discussed the conditions that Assange might face in the U.S. if he's extradited, like in the prison he might end up being in, and the solitary confinement and those conditions, as well as his mental state and like whether he's a suicide risk. So that's sort of a lot of stuff that we've heard over the last couple of weeks. They've also touched on some of the hacking stuff, which I think is very important. Because like that's the basis of some of his charges. He has 17 counts under the Espionage Act, and there's a couple that have to do with like computer intrusion. Like for example, the government claims that Assange was involved in some kind of password hacking attempt. But there have been witnesses recently, I think even just this week, who have, or it may have been last week, but who've challenged that idea of the password cracking, saying that Chelsea Manning did not even hand over enough information for someone to be able to do that, to crack a password. So this witness is saying it's not even possible that anyone made an attempt to crack any government computer or password. And this actually had come out in Manning's own legal case, actually, as Kevin Gostel has written about and pointed out. In fact, people should go read his recent article, "Prosecutors' Password Cracking Conspiracy Theory Against Assange Unravels." That's Google those terms and read up that article. There's a lot of interesting points about the hacking stuff. The defense has also raised the point that Assange's name wasn't even on the chat account that was used to communicate with Chelsea Manning. It used like a pseudonym of Nathaniel Frank, I think. So that there's actually no proof that like the person communicating with Manning, who's presumed to be Assange, there's no actual proof that it was Assange. That's sort of just like a supposition by the government. And they could not prove it was Assange during Manning's trial, and they still can't prove it now. So I think that was like a very strong point for the defense to have aired in court.
Can I just
Just
stick one more detail in there, Will? And
Oh yeah,
apparently, that account was used by multiple members of WikiLeaks,
yes,
with the intention of giving like plausible deniability that you don't know who was using that account. And so that seems like a important point to me that I didn't even know about until Kevin Gustola recently said that wasn't even that. They think this account was used by Julian Assange. They know this account was used by multiple people. And so that seems to be a real problem in their whole story here. That unless they have a particular way to prove that it was Julian Assange in the chat, then I don't know how you could possibly claim that he was involved in the hacking of these passwords and stuff. I think you would have to be able to find some way to show that it was actually him and not someone else. And it doesn't seem like they have any ability to do that.
yeah. That part adds like a whole other layer of like deniability to this whole thing. Like even if it had just like been assumed that it was only one person using it, they still didn't have proof it was Assange. But now that we know that multiple people have used this, then like you can't really it's really hard to pin this on one specific person. Which you would think their whole case would kind of have to rest on that, showing that the guy who they say did the thing did the thing. But I don't know. I guess that's that's how the law works sometimes. However, this week, though, as you mentioned, I think one of the very like most important parts of this whole the whole extradition hearing, I think, is the subject of UC Global, this Spanish security firm that was hired to guard the Ecuadorian embassy in London while Assange was holed up there, at least for like the second half of his stay there. Which and this company is run by a Spanish guy named David Morales, who also like heavily factors into this whole thing. There's actually been quite a bit of reporting on this in the Spanish press over the last year, especially a newspaper called El País, where they've been reporting on this a lot. There's also been a big legal case that's still ongoing in Spain as well, where David Morales, the guy who runs this company, has actually been charged for some of the stuff that you mentioned about the spying and stuff. So the story has been out for a while now, but we did hear a lot about this in the hearing this week. So this company is believed to have struck a deal with the CIA to spy on Assange while he was at the embassy. And we do know, like, Morales did at one point order his team to like beef up the security there. Like they, I think, added audio. Previously, it was only video surveillance, and he added audio to that in the building. So I think he beefed up some of the surveillance there, and reportedly he was sending this back to the CIA. And a major part of this is like he was apparently also sending back Assange's private discussions with his lawyers and stuff. And as I was saying to you before we went on air, like usually that would kind of get a case thrown out. This is something Joe Loria recently pointed out at Consortium News, that like if it's found the government is spying on somebody, like spying on their defense preparations, or paying somebody to do it, as would be the case here, that can get a case thrown out. Because like Assange was indicted under seal for like a year before it was ever announced and before he was arrested. And I'm sure he was aware of that. And so like this whole year before his arrest, he was very likely preparing for the very case that he's facing now. And so if the CIA is spying on him, while he's preparing for that, again, you'd think that should get this kind of tossed out. And that's actually what happened with Daniel Ellsberg, that he was slapped with Espionage Act charges. And it came out in the court case that they had wiretapped him, the government did, and that got everything dismissed. And so like, I was even seeing Ellsberg saying this himself, that he thinks that could set up a similar precedent here, that Assange's charges could be thrown out if this is proven that they spied on him. And that does seem pretty clear too. Like we have witnesses who actually testified anonymously during Assange's hearing, but we have witnesses saying that UC Global was not only surveilling him with video cameras and stuff, but also they were stealing documents from Assange that had relation to his defense. They were trying to get samples of his DNA and fingerprints and stuff, and as well as I think something you've mentioned on the show, trying to steal a dirty diaper from a baby who was regularly brought to visit Assange in the embassy, who I think did end up turned out to be his child.
Yes. And
all of that was apparently done at the behest of the CIA. And so like that is also stuff that is pretty damning in terms of like them spying on Assange, especially stealing documents and stuff. That's like, really spying on his defense preparations. And you also, the last thing I'll say here about how UC Global was mentioned in the hearings, you mentioned this, but like the most scandalous thing is the story where they apparently discussed kidnapping or even poisoning Julian Assange with their American contacts, these Spanish security people. And unfortunately, I don't think they got into a ton of detail about that in the testimony that was read in court. But nonetheless, this was mentioned. Just the fact that, like, indeed, UC Global had talked reportedly with their American contacts about either kidnapping or poisoning Assange. So that's pretty insane. And that's basically my recap, I guess, for this week so far.
Yeah, I mean, solid recap there, Will. As I mentioned at the start, this does seem to be the final week. This Friday, the 2nd, will end the testimony from witnesses, and we will not hear verbal testimony. I believe we got this confirmed from Noam Chomsky, who I believe is still like the top linguist in the world. Like as far as like the field of psychology goes, like Noam Chomsky is like one of the most important names. I think as a psychology major, his name probably came up along with like a few other people like Jung as much as anybody else, and as important as anybody else. So, they're not going to hear the testimony from this top psychiatrist, Patrick Coburn, one of the most important journalists that we have, especially reporting on the Middle East wars since the Arab Spring. He's not going to be able to testify, and probably the least well-known name, but I think the most important testimony that we're not going to actually get to hear is Andy Worthington, who has been just heroically reporting on all the torture program stuff all these years. And he could have gone up there and really talked about how important that Assange's documents, well, not Assange's, Chelsea Manning's documents that were released by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange were to really putting together the whole story of like the torture program and everything like that, and helping to get some, I don't know if you could call it justice, but at least less screwed for some of these people who were treated so poorly by us after 9/11. And it's very unfortunate that the court is unwilling to hear that. I know for Julian Assange, it seems like that's probably the most important thing. One of his main outbursts at the trial was around the fact that they're not letting the torture victims be heard, which is absurd. Like, if you're going to like expose a torture program, you should be able to hear from the victims of that program to explain why you went and exposed it and how terrible it was. But they
Yeah.
don't want that to be heard, because then it's going to be very hard to throw that guy in jail. And
Right.
I suppose, I mean, of course, John Kiriakou kind of disproves that in some ways. This is the guy who blew the whistle on the CIA torture program and then was the only one jailed for it. But him along with Assange and the Chelsea Manning leads are just so important, and yet they're the only people that are targeted. Not John Brennan, not Gina Haspel, not Dick Cheney, not David Tennant or John Yoo, and any of these people who are George W. Bush. I can't ever forget his name. All these people who should be in jail for rounding up random Muslims and torturing them. In the middle of our woke moment, we somehow forget that the now enlightened George W. Bush just randomly picked up and Muslim people because they were Muslim and tortured them at times to death. That's okay, and he could say at the game with Ellen, but Donald Trump is the evil. Anyways, well, that gets left out of the court is so important and so disappointing. It just shows that this really isn't about justice or making sure that people are safe, the rule of law is upheld, and that kind of thing, but rather an attempt to cover up the crimes of governments. And the UK government is tied into most of the crimes of the US government, so it's not surprising that they're helping facilitate this. The last thing I'll mention is just going back to the UC Global thing real quick, and Mads Blumenthal, points this out, is all those years that UC Global was spying, or I think it was at least 2 years, they're spying on Assange. Several mainstream journalists, people who work for organizations with massive legal teams and budgets, were also spied on. Their phones were scanned and stuff like that, and yet they don't seem to have any interest on reporting on this. I mean, I would imagine that if the Trump administration did that to these people, they would have been outraged and lost their minds. But here, it seems like not that big of a deal to any of them that, the U.S. government spied on them while they're going to meet with one of the, most important and heroic, leakers or whistleblowers or journalists, that we've ever had on the planet. And so it's a very I'll link to that article from the Gray Zone by Matt Blumenthal on that for anybody who wants to read that. I'll throw that in the show notes page. It's pretty solid and a good piece on just how all these mainstream journalists don't care.
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely recommend people go read that. It really does kind of show like, there's a real difference between like you can just tell the distinction between he mentions like how Glenn Greenwald and the Italian reporter Stefania Marizzi of the La Repubblica, they've written about this, about how the UC Global guys tried to spy on them and go through their devices and all this stuff. Whereas you have this Post journalist who, according to this, I think someone leaked this to Blumenthal. He has like these handwritten notes from a UC Global guard, apparently, that like the guy's talking about how he tried to take the voice recorder from this Washington Post reporter. And that reporter went and wrote about her visit with Assange, but did not mention the part where the security guard tried to spy on her. And I'm sure now a lot of these journalists are aware of the allegations against UC Global that they worked with the CIA to spy on Assange and sort of like feed information to the Americans. And they're still, their mouths are still shut. And you pointed this out the other day, I think on the HAPA show that we went on with our friend Shane Skelf. But they could very easily tie this into Trump's so-called war on journalism or whatever. It would be effortless for them to make that argument. But I guess they just hate Julian Assange so much, like because of his leaks of the Podesta emails and Hillary emails. I guess like he's just become like they just hate him so much that they won't do that. They maybe even hate him more than they hate Trump himself, which is I don't know how that's possible, but it does sort of, I don't know. You sometimes get that idea.
Yeah. Well, one of the very great points that Scott Horton always makes about the whole thing isn't just that they don't seem to care about Assange, but they've really profited over his work off of his work over the years. So many Pulitzer Prize stories and thousands and thousands of news stories have been written using the documents released by Julian Assange. They have been
Right.
critical to, providing the necessary evidence that like ties together different, sourcing reports and stuff. They'll get a couple unnamed sources to say something, but when you have the actual document from the government behind it, then you're actually confirming stories, and that's what Julian Assange put together
That's right.
for
Yeah.
a lot of these journalists. And now they completely turn their back on him. And it's not just on him, it's also on journalists, like you point out, Maritzi, who I think is really trying to get some other journalists to like sign on to her lawsuit against UC Global, and
And
to
they
be
won't.
like, and they won't. And it's so disappointing because, you know, this is a girl that they'll kind of try to outcast as, she's not a part of an outlet that Americans have heard of. It's not the Washington Post. It's not like the Guardian in the UK, even international stuff. If it's a big enough name, maybe people will pick it up. But
Right.
it's,
Republican, not so much.
yeah, it doesn't. Who even knows what language that is? Well, it could be Spanish or whatever. Um,
Armenian.
yeah, right. But that's that's kind of the position that she's in. And if other journalists would stand with her from the Washington Post, and that would give so much ground. And again, the war on journalism would be so easy to play up, but we're not seeing any of that here. And it's obvious that it's because they hate Julian Assange for, I have no idea why, I guess, giving them all those stories over the years. It's not
Right.
like he
Too many
hoards the
stories.
documents or anything like that and just, writes up the stories himself and then releases them and steals all the credit for all this. He just gives the documents. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess the last thing I'll mention about the Assange case is I'm not sure when the next Assange update will be. Maybe it'll actually be about the UC Global case, which has been going on in Spain kind of as this other case is going on in the UK, the extradition hearing. And it's very interesting that it doesn't seem like there's really any interest in kind of reporting those two stories together, especially in the U.S. mainstream media. It really only comes from the alternative media, Caitlin Johnstone, Matt Blumenthal, who are writing, hey, look, it's really strange that you have them looking into the fact that, they spied on Assange's privileged conversations here. The case precedent with Daniel Ellsberg is very clear that when they like tried to or planned to break into his psychiatrist's office to get those privileged conversations, that they then had to drop the charges against him. Seems like it would be a very nice like overlap and story to tell, but no interest in reporting the UC Global story at all. And if it does get mentioned, it's an aside from the extradition hearing itself. And the two need to be tied together because they're very tied together and very important together. Especially because I think Assange felt unable, or like his defense was partly compromised because of all the information the U.S. government and therefore the UK government has about his plans for defense. Then I think we're supposed to get written closing arguments within a couple of weeks of each side. But I don't know how much is what's going to matter or not, because the entire case that the defense team put together was off of the original indictment that the U.S. had put out, but they then introduced the superseding indictment later, and I don't think they really heard any evidence or witness testimony on the allegations in there that Assange was involved in other hacking or encouraging other people to hack different files and or different things aside from Chelsea Manning and the State Department cables and all of that. They
Right.
accused him of being involved in other hats and stuff like that. But that really doesn't play out at all in the hearings, as far as I could tell. But yet, I'm sure the judge is going to include that in her ruling. And so my guess is Assange did not end up with a very fair trial here, and they're going to use this as a rubber stamp at the end of the day, and hopefully it'll be one of the appeals to the higher court in the UK where he could actually maybe earn his freedom here.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely continue to update Assange. Like, even though the testimony and the hearing and stuff won't, we might not be able to update that too much. Certainly, we will continue to update his situation. Like there will still be reporting on this from people like Craig Murray and stuff, and Consortium News, and from us. So people can look forward to that.
All right, well,